Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm all right.
Yeah.
I'm doing great, actually. It's been
Okay.
lovely not to be blogging for, what is it, 8 months? It's been lovely.
We're going to talk about that. But talking about your new life, let me introduce this quickly. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcasts. You're Andrew Sullivan. You probably need no introduction for most of our viewers slash listeners, but just in case, you're a noted, generally conservative, but occasionally liberal thinker. You've written books and so on. You were a very early and very influential advocate of gay marriage. You were also very early in the blogging game. You're a blogging pioneer. You for more than 10 years kept at it, innovating influentially, I would say, and you had a very large following. And then within the last year, you announced that blogging had come to overwhelm your life to an unhealthy extent, and you were going to call it quits, at least for the time being. And I guess that was 8 or 9 months ago.
Yeah.
And now here you are to talk about the meaning of your life. Is that okay if we talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying earlier, it's not a subject that most people feel very comfortable talking about, and it's a huge topic. But I agree with you. In many ways, the last 8 months have been a period of inevitably when you end a certain period of your life, and I gave myself around 12 months of reflection, really, to what the Jesuits call discern what I want to do or God wants me to do next. And so I've been on that. I've changed my day, my habits, my life. I sort of instituted three what I thought were achievable goals, or rather rules. Like I meditate now for half an hour a day.
Now, is this a mindfulness meditation or Christian meditation or just none of the above?
It's a combination of, well, I got a little training through transcendental meditation techniques. Then I subscribed to actually an online meditation guide. Maria Popova, I don't know whether you know Maria, but she's quite a wonderful person, and she directed me to a person called Tara Brach.
Yes, in the Washington, D.C. area.
In Bethesda, yeah. And so that gives me, I do about 5 minutes of listening to her and a sort of beginning of a guide, and then I do about 20 to 25 minutes of my own silence. And it's mainly traditional Buddhist originated meditation, but it's also, I think, completely compatible and extremely similar to the Christian understanding of contemplation that I've long been fascinated by. Thomas Merton is one of my heroes, one of my mentors, and
you actually knew Thomas Merton?
No.
Okay. So mentor in the virtual sense.
Yes, just in the sense that his work, and particularly towards the end of his career, his exploration of the connections between Christianity and Buddhism were very fruitful, I think, and very interesting, and resurrecting the concept and placing the concept of contemplation back into the center of the Christian experience was one of the things that he was attempting to do. He's not the only person to be attempting to do this, but so I meditate, but in a sort of rather neutral fashion, non-denominational, as it were. But it's funny, I always feel towards the end of it the presence of Jesus there. And I try and end with the Lord's Prayer. So it's a slightly ad hoc.
Eclectic. Let's call it eclectic.
Yeah, okay, eclectic.
Catholic with a small c, Andrew?
Yeah, well, that's what I've always been, Bob. I mean, it's been. I'm not a convert to Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not wedded to the entire apparatus. We can talk about this some more. But I am definitely part of the Catholic tradition. I feel very much at home in it. It's my spiritual home, and for all sorts of autobiographical reasons, it's a place which I do not want to leave. And even though it was incredibly hard over the last couple of decades in particular, the new Pope has definitely opened the shutters and let some air and sunlight in a way that some of us were praying for and hoping for a very long time. So but I'm a different Catholic than I was when I was a kid. I'm a different Catholic than when I was a teenager. I'm a different Catholic than when I was in my 20s. And I think the kind of Catholicism that I have, or Christianity that I've adopted, really has evolved out of all of those experiences. And we can talk about them if you want, but it's and it's not a process of, I'm not born again. There was never a moment in my life at which I suddenly went from one thing to another. I was born into this church, which is a total contingency, but I've constantly doubted and questioned it, and ended up in a place that is not orthodox in many respects.
What would you say are the key things that you have retained from the tradition you were born into, setting aside for now the things that you have brought in from the outside, so to speak? What is the essence of Catholicism or Christianity from your point of view that it's made sense to keep?
The abiding sense that the message and life of Jesus of Nazareth represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness, both in terms of what he said, but just as important in terms of how he lived, in upending an entire way of being that I think has brought us to an access to a higher consciousness, a higher, more liberated way of being that comes from a higher power that reaches us in a way that is utterly mysterious, but that we somehow recognize when it appears. And I think it can appear in many ways, and I also believe it can appear in many religious forms. I'm an ecumenical person, but for me, the testimony in the Gospels remain as vivid and as powerful and as real as they've ever been. For me, the actual presence of Jesus in my life is real, and the sacraments of the Church are also a critical part of my engagement in that reality. And I think that's and the higher consciousness is really about the extraordinarily counterintuitive abandonment of oneself for others.
Okay, is that the key when you referred to a kind of an upending of consciousness or a revolution in consciousness or whatever you said that Jesus represented? Is that the essence of it, the abnegation of self, or if abnegation is even the right word?
Much
yeah,
as the understanding that to save your life you have to lose it, and the utterly counterintuitive thing, which is that to make yourself defenseless is to find the only security.
Okay, there's a lot there. So to find your life, you have to lose it. That's a literal passage from the New Testament. And that.
I'm also, I must say, an entirely New Testament Christian. I totally understand that the Hebrew Scriptures are essential to understanding the context in which Jesus operated, but I think he essentially transcended that in a way that is still an extremely radical way and an extremely controversial way, and a very difficult way. Yeah, that's roughly it, and it is about the possibility. Here's what I would say: I've never not believed in God. And I can't really tell you why. It goes back to my childhood. Obviously, it goes back to the contingent fact, which anybody debating me will be happy to bring up, that I just happened to be born in a particular place and time in a particular family which holds a particular religion, and I have remained in that faith tradition. But at the same time, there's plenty of people that happens to that grow to disillusioned or realize this stuff is bullshit, or appalled by whatever hypocrisies and so on within that tradition, or who just simply intellectually or emotionally and spiritually move on. That hasn't happened to me. At least the movement that I've made has always been within that context. And that is just a feeling that reality has meaning, which is not a given,
Right.
and that the universe has meaning, and that the meaning is the unbelievable and ineffable love of the force behind everything for creation, including us, but also everything else in creation, but including us. And the only time that sense has disappeared from me was 15 minutes at the age of 29.
I have to ask, what happened at that? What occasioned the lapse?
Well, it's the classic theodicy question, really.
The problem of evil.
Yes, and I would say it wasn't that I thought that God did not exist. I thought that, because for me, that's not really something I can fight my way out of. I didn't forget that in my 15 minutes. The thought was that God was evil. Mm-hmm. That the force behind all things, the ground of our being, was essentially evil. And the reason that I had that experience, I think, which was surrounded by a lot of other very intense spiritual experiences around that period of time, both before and after, was that I found out at 29 that I got this disease that was killing everybody around me, and I had witnessed and taken care of people who had died of it. I had 4 people I dated who had died, and my best friend was also sick, and my boyfriend at the time also came down with viral meningitis as an early indicator of HIV. My best friend came down with pneumocystis at the age of 28.
And this was right when the effective treatments were just about to emerge, or were starting to emerge, but it was considered a death sentence at this point.
It was 1993.
Uh-huh.
The key thing to remember is, and none of the press and nothing was telling us that any hope was coming.
Right. In fact, the standard phrase was the deadly HIV virus. That appeared a billion times in print.
Everyone had died.
Right.
And everyone was still dying. But more importantly, the biggest years for death were 94 and 95 and 96. Mm-hmm. We think of the AIDS epidemic as starting and going down, but in fact it started ramping up. And there was no and it was terrifying. So that the year I got it was a particularly terrifying period to be around, because the deaths were becoming simply overwhelming. like the local gay paper had like 12 pages of obits a week of everybody that you'd seen around or known. This was a huge event in a tiny world, and it was also just a horrible way to die. I mean, the torments these poor men went through were just to watch them, to observe them, to pick up a person covered in his own shit, a pile of bones, screaming from pain with neuropathy, to see all these people who were doubly stigmatized, to see people who had been thrown out of hospitals or thrown away from their partner's funeral or thrown out of their apartments. This was an extraordinarily traumatizing event for most of us who were in the middle of it. And it was hard to convey at the time. You and I were working together at the time, but it was extremely hard to convey what was going on in our lives, because it was simply we were like medievals living among moderns, really. Anyway, that's just to say that it's hard to remember what it felt like at the time. People have looked back and they don't remember how terrifying it was. But anyway, what happened was that then I got it, and it was in late June I found out, and then by August it was coming up to my 30th birthday. So I was actually in Provincetown at the time, and couldn't tell anybody either, because I was editor.
Were you out of the closet at that point?
As gay?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've been out of the closet.
So that was
forever.
Because when you wrote the pro-gay marriage piece with New Republic, you were not yet out of the closet, right?
I certainly was in the office, and I was.
I don't remember it being very explicit, but maybe I was just not part of the right coffee clatches. I don't know, but anyway.
Well, at that point, 89, I was actually back in Boston. So I wrote that piece when I was back writing my dissertation, actually. Okay. But I was out.
So you were definitely openly gay by the time you found out you were HIV positive.
I've been openly gay since I was openly gay when I was appointed editor, which was 91. So I was openly gay for a long time. I mean, that's. But anyway, but I had to keep the HIV secret because it would have been impossible to. At that point, everybody looked at you like a corpse, a walking corpse, and they also, all this sympathy would have flowed or whatever. There'd been also, and I just didn't think you could edit a national magazine with that shit going on. And also, I also had the added terror of the fact that immediately my green card had to be withdrawn because HIV was an excludable disease. So I was also simultaneously basically told I couldn't stay in America any longer either. At the same time, my mother, who is bipolar, was in a particularly brutal hospitalization. She's throughout my childhood and adolescence and adulthood, she's been in and out of mental institutions with this horrible disease, and she was in incredible pain. And talking to her on the phone, as I tried to do a lot, was just, it gutted me. And my best friend, Pat, also was just completely distraught and stripped. I mean, he was a big bodybuilder. Overnight, he'd lost all this weight. He looked terrible. The guy I was dating at the time was sick too. And I was just walking to the beach through the dunes, and I just was thinking about this and just thinking, what did my mother ever do to deserve the suffering that she is undergoing, which is in some ways mental health suffering can be the worst of any suffering. Or these are the good people. These I may have been whatever I was, but I certainly had no doubt that my friend Patrick, my boyfriend Chris, and my mother and countless other people who were afflicted by this were good people. And I don't know what, it wasn't really a thought. It just came over me like a huge feeling that God was deliberately persecuting these good people for the hell of it. And it was just not fair. And and I fell to my knees, and I couldn't get up for about 15 minutes, and they were the darkest 15 minutes of my life. And then all I can say is that I got up and walked to the beach, and I don't believe that I got up entirely of my own will. And then my belief back in the benign reality of what we might call godness, for want of a better word, because I think the word God has become so laden with anthropomorphic, anthropocentric, weird stuff. It's a word that has actually come to exclude, for many people, what we're talking about, as opposed to make it more accessible. But yeah, and ever since then, that's what I believed. And it redirected my life to some extent. It was not a born-again experience. It was like a near-death experience spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
There have been moments in my life when I have been overwhelmed with a sense of the presence of Jesus around me, and with me. So that's, and since then, that remembering what that was like, remembering also when you are faced with mortality, when you really are faced with death, mm-hmm. in the raw, you are forced in a way that a lot of people aren't most of the time in our culture, especially when you're doing it when you're young, to really come to terms with some of these big questions. Your spirituality does not become some sort of hobby. Mm-hmm. It becomes your life, because there's no way to cope with the possibility of your imminent death without finding a place in your soul or your mind where it can't get you.
So I take it you did not kind of intellectually resolve the problem of evil in the sense of suddenly, conceptually understanding how a good and omnipotent God could, would tolerate all this suffering, but you had a kind of a conviction that ultimately the source of being is a good and loving force.
Yeah, and not only that, but a personally connected force for love and compassion and forgiveness. And that Jesus, for me, again, I say for me, I agree with the Pope that proselytism is solemn nonsense, as he put it. For me, the words of Jesus and the stories of his life just constantly speak the truth to me, and always have done.
Okay, so it's interesting. On the one hand, you're reluctant to think of God in anthropomorphic terms, it sounds like, or to talk about God in ways that seem to suggest that. At the same time, you're very you feel a strong sense of the presence of Jesus, the figure, who was, to say the least, anthropomorphic, right?
Well, he's incarnate.
Right.
So
it's just
godness is more than just the Son. It's also, the mystery of Christianity is the incarnation of the divine. That's and I feel that every day. Mm-hmm. I do feel the universe and creation around me is full of the divine. It's full of extraordinary wonder and beauty and enlightenment. And one reason every summer I go to Cape Cod, the end of Cape Cod, and I don't move for 3 months, is to experience the godness of that landscape. And as I said, I was there when that happened. I go there. It's sort of my Mecca, as it were. It's the place I go to listen to God and to be with him. And to see the landscape itself, the water, the sand, the sky, the clouds, immanent with godness. Mm-hmm. And there is something about that part of the world I mean, there's a reason why Thoreau and Emerson, the transcendentalists, were all hanging out on Cape Cod.
Mm-hmm.
There is something about the light there and the landscape there that it's a bit like a desert, in the sense that you're aware very much of God there.
Mm-hmm. So for you to believe in God is to feel ultimately loved. Is that fair?
Yes, and forgivable.
And forgivable. And here's something that just occurred to me recently. I mean, the forgiveness, it seems to me, has kind of two dimensions. On the one hand, there's, forgiveness for specific acts. And of course, the Catholic Church has ritualized that in the form of confession. I did A, B, and C. Okay, you're forgiven for doing A, B, and C. But
it's not quite like that, Bob.
I've never done it, so I'll have to take your word.
It's not quite like that.
Well, okay, yeah. I didn't mean to trivialize it. It was a kind of a time-saving way of describing it.
Yeah, but it's a bit of a cliche about what it is. It's probably called the sacrament of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no longer sit down, tick off the bad things you did that day and get absolved from. It's a conversation about the state of your spiritual life and how it has gone astray, how better to reform it. And when the times I've gone to use the sacrament, it's been face to face. It's been sitting down in a chair with a priest, and hashing stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little more in the modern church. It's a lot more. It's not quite the caricature that a lot of people think it is.
Well, then maybe there's more convergence between it and what I was going to call the second side of forgiveness, which is, and this just occurred to me while I was meditating the other day. It was kind of like I got this feeling of just a kind of reassurance that you're doing your best. You're trying. I mean, it's easy to feel, and maybe it's easier to feel this if you were brought up religiously, as I was, but it's easy to feel almost a sense of chronic shortcoming and failure. You know what I mean? Like I was put on this planet to do good things, and I'm never really
doing what I'm doing, which is nothing,
right.
And that's a very Catholic feeling too. I mean, we feel that all the time, and I think I don't think it's a Christian thing to feel.
You mean
because there is forgiveness, and
right, and I guess I'm talking about the forgiveness in that diffuse sense. In other words, feeling a sense of reassurance that look, you're doing your best. You're gonna come up short. You're doing your best. Calm down. It's like, which is separate from being forgiven for specific acts. Does that make it? Anyway, it just occurred to me. I had this feeling of that kind of consolation and reassurance just through meditation, and it was almost the first time I had felt it in exactly those terms. And it just reminded me that is really the almost the heart and soul of the appeal of a certain kind of religion, I guess. I mean, it's a kind of ongoing and diffuse forgiveness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because God is forgiveness, and because we are made of God, but the fate of humans is to glimpse it and never realize it, but to have it, but to fail to realize it. Mm-hmm. And that is what it means to be human. I mean, so when the current Pope was first asked, how do you define yourself? I mean, and he said, I'm a sinner. And I don't think he meant that in a sort of self-flagellating way. He meant that entirely in a way that, yeah, we're all human.
That's doctrine. He's got to accept that if he's Pope, right? I mean, that's Christian doctrine.
Yes, but to say so, but it is. But you wouldn't have realized it. You can't imagine Benedict XVI saying that I'm a sinner. Mm-hmm. You would feel that Benedict would be worried that his authority might be in some way impugned by that confession, even though it is completely orthodox. Mm-hmm. And that's just who we are. I mean, we hurt one another. We protect ourselves in ways that actually hurt ourselves. We think certain things are going to make us happy, owning more things, earning more money, being successful, having fame or celebrityhood or whatever. They don't. They won't. They can't. So something else must. And I think Jesus here, in some ways, is a tone of voice, and godness is an almost tone of voice. One of my favorite passages in the Gospels, which I can cite, unlike Donald Trump, is the Martha Mary story, where it's a very simple story, and it's a strange story to put into if you think the gospel is a propaganda, it's a strange story to put in there. Mm-hmm. I think it has all the ring of truth to it. Jesus shows up unannounced at the house of friends of his, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. He's close friends, very close friends. But he shows up unannounced, and only Mary and Martha are there, and they're completely flummoxed, and he wants to stay the night, and it's not really kosher. Literally, for a man in first century Palestine, single man to stay with two single women, sisters. Anyway, but leaving that aside, Martha just panics and runs around in a very human way, fixing things up. They weren't prepared. She's going to the kitchen. She's running around. Mary, her sister, just sits at Jesus' feet and hangs out. And eventually Martha loses it and says, Jesus, can't you see how much I got to do? Can you tell Mary to come help me? And Jesus says this. He says, Martha, Martha, you fret and worry about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. Mary's taken the better path. Don't take it from her.
Don't take what?
Don't take it from her.
So, in the better path there consists of what? Not worrying about the superficial and trivial?
Being with him.
Uh-huh.
Being with him. Just being with him. Not even talking, just being. So much of life is about being with other people. Mm-hmm. Not even entertaining them, not even riveting them, but just being there with them. And there's nothing more precious to a human being than time. And spending time with someone is the ultimate indication of how much you care for them. And look, here's the Son of God sitting in your living room. What are you doing in the kitchen? And there's a level at which it's sort of calmed down. What I'm saying is that there's not a condemnation of Martha rather. Mm-hmm. He's not like, you are a sinner, you will go to hell, you won't understand anything. It's just like, I love you, Martha. If only you knew what was best for you. Mm-hmm. And that's the tone of voice that God has for me. It is, Andrew, why are you doing this again? Look, why are you lost here? Why have you not stood up to the plate? Why did you look away from that person? Why did you not open your heart to that person? But it's not, he loves me. So it's that voice.
And has your, in looking back on your years of blogging and so on, has there been a tension between what you were doing and the extent of your devotion to your career and the ideal you've now just put forth? Or
absolutely.
And so you are vowing to.
It was one of the contributing factors, apart from the breakdown of my physical health. It was the sense that I had crowded out. That you blog for 7 or 8 hours a day in front of 100,000 people a day or whatever I was doing. And the delusion that you could be with people as well as be with them. In other words, that's where I lived. Mm-hmm. I came to the conclusion that's where I lived. Those 8 hours are not made up with another 8 hours of the day where I can be with my friends or do the things I'm supposed to do. Now, some of what I did is completely defensible from a Christian point of view. I definitely was doing my best to
Well,
figure
well,
out.
wouldn't you say that doing your best to make the world a better place by your lights is a Christian thing to do?
Yeah,
And in theory, isn't that what you were doing kind of
yeah,
24/7?
yeah, yeah. And so I'm not bashing myself too much about that, but that it was so unbalanced, was so consuming, that the ability to just be physically as a human being with another human being, and to spend more time in the real world, and to connect that real world with your feelings and your body.
Mm-hmm.
These were things that I felt had sort of become etiolated, and I was living this virtual life,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed to restore a sense of what it was to be a human being in a body with a soul among human beings who are actually people I can look in the face, talk to, touch,
Mm-hmm.
engage.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying what I was doing was sinful. I'm not. It wasn't. And there is a way in which the work I did was obviously designed to make the world a better place. I think the fact that so many couples can get married in America, their families, that gives me huge pride that people will never know in some way were affected in a small way by something I wrote or campaigned about, and it changed their lives. Because a marriage is a big deal to change your life, heal families, and so on and so forth. So I'm not trying to be self-flagellating here, but I think primarily what happened was that my life was so full of noise and distraction, so full of the latest synapse that I had to respond to,
Mm-hmm.
that the digital world we live in is so overwhelming and so constant and pervasive that I had lost silence. I had lost contemplation. I had lost the time needed to spend with my friends or my husband or just my dogs or just being in nature. These things that make us human.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I'd gotten the balance completely out of whack, and it had become an obsessive, compulsive, addictive behavior that was rendering it harder and harder to be the kind of person I felt like God wanted me to be.
So you said you're going to take a year off and think about things and reflect. Is it becoming clear to you now what you'll do at the end of the year?
Not entirely. I mean, I'm the thing I'm trying to figure out is whether I have the ability to write a book about my faith. Because, like a lot of Christians, I'm kind of mortified by the way Christianity is largely portrayed in the popular culture, certainly among the younger generations, which is, this Christianity is in crisis. There's no question about it. I think religion in general is in crisis in modernity.
And as a result of what forces? I mean, on the one hand, you've got, it seems, increasingly fundamentalist manifestations of it in various traditions.
That's part of the crisis. I mean, because those are more fanatical ideologies, I think, of religion rather than the practice of faith as we properly know it. Mm-hmm. It isn't bound to local communities. It isn't bound to tradition. It isn't bound to ritual. It isn't bound to all the mediating institutions of religious faith. It's a very abstract, absolutist, universal, can be found out on the internet and used for political purposes, mm-hmm. which is that is, and the fact that it has Christianity or Islam attached to it, it's what the Pope recently called it an ideology of God. And I think one of the key insights for me, and this comes from my reading of Oakeshott many years ago, is re-understanding faith not as a set of a myriad doctrines which have to be somehow accepted, but remembering that faith is a way of life, that it's about how you live, and that someone living a Christian life is a Christian. Someone simply professing you have to believe this, this, and these abstractions, which tend to be incredibly abstract, or you're not one, have missed the point. The religion belongs, properly speaking, to the practical world, not the intellectual one. And that the practices of religion, namely, for example, daily prayer, or meditation, whatever you want to call it, these are there to teach us how to be, how to live. And that's what Jesus is talking about for the whole Gospels. He's talking about specific situations, specific metaphors, specific ways of interacting with our other human beings. And he's pointing to a way of reacting and relating to people that really would heal things rather than make things worse. And I think most of the great advances that we've made, and I agree with you that religion has progressed. I mean, to put a plug in for your great book, The Evolution of God. That's a beautiful book.
It's nice of you to say that.
Well, it's true, and I gained a lot of insight from it, because I think it's previously. I mean, to some extent, my old worldview was the world has always been the same way, but the truth is it hasn't. And for a Christian, obviously the emergence of Jesus is a huge consciousness shifter, and I think we're still figuring out the consequences of what Jesus meant in our lives and in our churches. But above all, it's not about doctrine or the application of an ideology or anything to do with politics. It is simply a way of life, and a way of looking at the world. And also, we're both infinitesimally insignificant by any standard measure in terms of what we know about the universe.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, that makes Christianity all the more radical in believing that there is still something benign in it. And I'll tell you a couple of things that also affected me more recently. And one was this extraordinary documentary called Into Great Silence, or Die große Stille in the German, by Philipp Gröning, which was a documentary in the Carthusian monastery in the Alps in which no outsider had been for hundreds of years. It's a silent order, it's a lifetime order, and it's a 3-hour movie with no words. And there was, if you really live what the phrase Oakeshott uses is sub specie aeternitatis, under the fully aware of both the infinitude of time and space and one's own place in it at all times, because that perspective is one we as humans to survive had to just shout, put on bracket. Mm-hmm. But you live differently. There was a way a monk walked in that movie, just walked from A to B, in which he was not trying to go from A to B. Mm-hmm. He was just walking. That is very hard to explain until you saw it. But the minute I saw it, I stopped dead in my tracks. I mean, I was just mesmerized by it. And I've met holy people like that. My grandmother, my Irish grandmother, who was the 7th of 13 kids, and was an immigrant and lived with us while I was growing up. She was, barely literate, certainly not educated in any way. Embarrassed me a little bit. I was a precocious young English boy. This was this Irish, really Irish grandmother who had a broad Irish accent. In church, she would say the Hail Mary and Our Father louder than anybody else, and she would rattle through the rosary like you were listening to someone narrating a NASCAR race. I mean, it was just like this blah, 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 blah. But there were moments when I saw her transported, and there was a calm to her life, an amazing calm to it that entranced me, because she was the opposite of me in so many ways, and yet she had something I couldn't get. Mm-hmm. And that has always been in my consciousness, really, and I want to get there. And there were moments during these horrible crises in my life when I did get there because I had to get there. Mm-hmm. And then there have been moments when I've seen it. The other thing, and this is more controversial, is that I think certain drug experiences that I've had have also confirmed this to me, not in ways that I have experienced as being some sort of imposition of some sort of weird feeling into you, but simply an unveiling of what's already there.
These are psychedelic experiences?
Yes, I'm talking about psilocybin primarily, which is an extraordinary thing. And even though it's fake in a sense, it just simulates the kind of religious calm that, people doing fMRI studies have shown that, in fact, it's the same bloody thing as meditation. I mean, it just affects the same part of the brain.
Right.
But nonetheless, it's not. Once you've seen a glimpse of that mountaintop, it's hard to forget it. And you live in the peace of knowing it's there. And even though it's not there every day in your life at all. And those have been, spiritual experiences for me, even though they've been under pharmaceutical influences.
Mm-hmm. So the it that's there, so it involves, on the one hand, liberation from the ordinary constraints on perception that I would say presumably were designed into us by natural selection to keep us focused on natural selection's agenda of like surviving and having sex and stuff and amassing goods and food,
protecting ourselves and worrying about what's going to kill us and all the rest of it.
So it's a liberation from that, but it's also a glimpse of something that's there that we normally don't see because we're so preoccupied.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is the core problem with Western civilization. In fact, we have gotten to the point where we don't need a lot of those natural selection traits. We live in an extraordinarily peaceful, largely ordered society in which our basic needs are basically met. I don't want to diminish how tough it is for people out there in places much worse than me, but nonetheless, compared to the whole scope of human history, we're living in an age in which, and it seems likely to continue, in which we have the luxury of actually being able not to worry about all those natural selection pressures in quite the same way we used to.
And I would personally add, to the extent that that's not the case, in other words, the extent that there are looming perils to a peaceful world out there, and we see many of them vividly manifest around the world, solving those problems, I think, involves liberating ourselves from some of the biases built into us by natural selection. I mean,
yes,
tribalism is, groupism is designed into us and is an increasingly counterproductive trait.
Yes, and one could say the core feature of Jesus or someone like St. Francis was to see the other. I mean, St. Francis' great moment was coming back as a prisoner of war and walking into a leper colony and hugging these people. Mm-hmm. That sensibility, that ability to see the humanity in people who are utterly unlike ourselves, and to break tribalism entirely. Jesus' breaking of all these sort of connections is pretty radical. Even the family, I have to say, that he was not a huge fan of. Mm-hmm. Certainly not very concerned with. In favor of this self-giving, this constant openness, which is part of the solution. No, it's not part of the solution. It is the solution. It's just incredibly hard for our nature, our genetic wiring to do that, even though there's plenty in our genetic wiring that also facilitates it. Mm-hmm. But the faith in a benign God and the possibility of our being good really comes from the notion that all those things in natural selection, which have actually made us want to cooperate, want to care for one another, actually can lead to a point where they eclipse the others and we can live in harmony. I mean, that is what when I say in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, that's what I mean.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a question related to that. Let me put forth one perspective that you would not call Christian or even theistic you might call it spiritual but not religious, but you would probably call it closer to secular than your perspective. And tell me how close it actually is to yours, which is just, if you believe, okay, first of all, there's good and there's bad. Okay, in the universe there are moral absolutes. Moral truth is for real. There are built into my nature by natural selection things that do the bidding of good and things that do the bidding of bad. If you want to call the part of my nature that does the bidding of good, for example, compassion when it's really diffusely bestowed, or just an ability to detach myself from my own perspective and see things clearly, or whatever. If you want to call that divine, you can, but the kind of worldview I'm imagining doesn't necessarily invoke a God, but it does believe there is this thing in me that is the good. There is this thing in me that is the bad. And I want to engage in spiritual disciplines such as meditation that bring the good more to the fore. And when I do that, I believe I'm bringing myself closer to the good and allowing something in the universe, in some sense, that is good, allowing it to more fully manifest. Something that is in some sense built into the universe, allowing itself to more fully manifest itself through me. Okay, so that's a worldview. It's not theistic. It doesn't involve a God.
Well, it does in a way. There's something in the universe that you referred to that seems to be enabling you to be a better and happier person, because happiness is also involved here. Because these people are much happier than these hedge. I mean, I don't really envy these hedge fund people. I mean, they're just miserable. A lot of them. Yeah, that's something in the universe that's been programmed into us. This thing called grace is godness. To believe that that's there at all is an act of faith. I mean, that's it. And it means that you believe that things can be overcome, that even the darkest human problems and human hatreds can be transcended, but only this way. That's why, I mean, I don't want to bring in Ta-Nehisi's latest book, but I thought in some ways the most interesting thing about it to me is its atheism. The utter rejection of hope, the utter refusal to accept any tangible progress. The notion that America in 2015 is as bad as it was in 1815, and the same things are happening all over again. He's very explicit. It's because I don't believe in the civil rights movement's religiosity. I don't believe that there's a happy ending anywhere. I think it's basically Marxism without the happy ending. Even Marx wanted to have a happy ending in there through dialectical materialism, but he was just borrowing Christianity, almost like Hegel was in some sense. No, for me, the great critic, the essential critic of Christianity is Nietzsche. That's the key opponent of this worldview, which is stop kidding yourselves. None of this is real.
Well, and moral truth is not absolute.
No, moral truth is whatever you want it to be, and there's nothing out there that leading us to the good or bad. There's just you and your will to power. And be honest, the times when my faith has been most shaken has been reading Nietzsche, because his mockery of Christianity is so spot on. His psychological ability to get under your skin and make you feel like this is just pathetic. What I'm doing, so this is completely pathetic. I'm turning the other cheek to this asshole. What on earth do you think you're doing? But he does so in such a hilarious and sort of over the top and fascinating way that I think those are the choices. Jesus or Nietzsche, myself. For me, at least, those are the fundamental choices that I face. And at some level, those are not intellectually resolvable. But as I tried to explain earlier, they can be physically, spiritually, and psychologically real.
Okay.
Um,
Final question.
yeah.
You mentioned the crisis that religion is undergoing. I don't know to what extent you see that as related to the rise of the so-called new atheists. Certainly, a greater prominence given to arguments that religion is A, intellectually vacuous, but B, a bad thing. But in any event, there has been the rise in prominence of those arguments. And I'm just curious as to how uncomfortable a time it is, from your point of view, to be an intellectual and professing Christian faith. There's not all that much of that I'm aware of. And you know, you remain in intellectual conversation with the Sam Harrises of the world. I mean, I'm thinking about your blog.
Well, we did a whole dialogue together.
Right. So like, I mean,
and I was, of course, best friends with Hitch.
Yeah. And Chris Hitchens. And so, I mean, it's not for you to declare yourself courageous. I'm not asking you to do that, but I assume it's like it's hard. I mean, assume it's hard to do what you're doing.
Well, that's why doing this book is going to be a challenge, and why finding a way to make arguments about what. Because let me I do not blame new atheists for the reputation of Christianity. I blame Christianity for the reputation of Christianity. I think a huge amount that, I mean, I read Christopher's book and I agreed with almost all of it. It missed the point. It's very easy to point out how idiotic human beings have been with respect to religion and still are, and the abuse of it. But at the same time, I do believe that in some ways the only thing that will beat bad religion is good religion. And I agree with them fundamentally that fundamentalism is a huge problem, and that it stems from pride. If God exists, he is by definition beyond our understanding. Those who claim to know literally everything, down to like when you should take a dump or how you should, the minutiae of your sexual or eating habits. I mean, this stuff is insane. And I'm one of these Christians that has no problem whatsoever with accepting all the new scholarship that we know about the origins of the scriptures. I think we have to take them for what they are, which is Chinese whispers, essentially, after 60 years. Remarkable and vivid Chinese whispers that suggest something very remarkable occurred and affected a lot of people, but they're not infallible, literal documents. In fact, that's absurd. I take on fully modern science and evolution and natural selection. I see no conflict there whatsoever with what I'm believing. And I do think that mainstream Christianity, let alone mainstream Islam, has not really faced fully the consequences of what we now know. You cannot talk about the Bible as if it is literally true without telling a lie. And it's just not true. And there's a reason why Islam will not allow scholarly inquiry into the origins of the texts that created the Quran. We know better. And as a Christian, I also believe, in the beginning was Logos, that the world can be understood, that we are not, blind faith is not faith. Pascal put it best in saying that, that there's the use and submission of reason, but you have to use it. And if reason is telling you that what you're saying, if you're still saying that the world was created 6,000 years ago, you are not a Christian. You're not interested in the truth.
Yeah.
And religion has to be compatible with truth. So I don't know. I mean, it's going to be the thing I'm struggling with right now, Bob, to be honest, with this book, is how do I approach it? How do I get into this conversation in ways that does not imply that I'm revealing some sort of truth, but that this Christianity still matters? I actually think that a lot of what Christianity actually is quite well loved. It's actually sort of still basic civic religion. Americans in general do believe in helping those in trouble. They do believe in giving away their own goods to others. They believe in being kind to one another. I mean, there's a lot in our culture that is very, very rooted in Christianity. Of course, it can be rooted in other things as well. I'm not claiming so, but historically speaking, that's our cultural tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are more people out there who are more Christian than they think they are. And I think there's a way in which a gay man, a sexually active gay man, can maybe get a hearing and say, I'm still there, and here's why. And it's not because I'm a self-hating homosexual or I believe this, that, and the other. It's because of these things. And I think what the Pope has done, the new Pope, has been able to reset the priorities to some extent to actually refocus us on the core truths of religion. And he's done it in words, but he's also done it as Jesus did, in gestures and actions and just moments, which has been incredibly inspiring. But he's just the Pope.
Well, it's a living.
As he himself would say, I'm just the Bishop of Rome.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you.
People love him. Secular people love him. Why do they love him? They love him because he's a Christian. And when they actually...
You mean because he's acting like a Christian, or because...
acting like a Christian.
Yeah.
And when you see it, it's hard not to be affected by it.
And you would say acting like a Christian more than some popes you could mention if you were less tactful.
But yeah, it's a wonderful to have that kind of Christian action in the papacy.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've been at this slightly more than an hour. I could go on longer, and so maybe you will grace us with your presence down the road, and we could continue the conversation.
Well, maybe when I'm embarking on this impossible book, I'll come back on.
Yeah, it sounds like you're committed to it. I'd be happy to be a sounding board throughout the process.
Thank you. I am. Of all the things I could do now, it's the most challenging. So I think in some ways I should do the most challenging thing.
Absolutely.
And I think it's incredibly relevant. I just think that my fear is that it falls in between everybody's stools, that traditional Catholics and evangelicals will throw it away and the seculars will not give a shit. But at the same time...
No, you're in much better shape than I was in when I wrote the book you mentioned. Believe me. There's an audience there. I mean, that book did fine, but I just remember an editor saying to me, not the editor ultimately published the book, he said, what I like about this is that on the one hand, you've got this materialist view of history and how it works. On the other hand, you're arguing that there may be a larger purpose at work. And there's hardly anybody who believes both of those things. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's a problem when it comes to actually selling it, that there's no one who agrees.
Sam Harris always says that I have a parish of one.
You've got a... There's a large and welcoming audience.
Well, who cares?
That awaits you.
I want to write it for myself in a way.
Well, I'll tell you, Andrew. Final little anecdote about you that you don't know. You may not remember. We ran into each other in DuPont Circle about 6, 7, 8 years ago, and I was listening to music on earbuds, and the exact Pink Floyd lyric that was playing when I saw you was. Did you exchange a lead role in a cage for a walk-on... No, did you exchange a walk-on part in a war for a lead role in a cage? And I would say that means, among other things, do not pursue don't let what you do be determined by the quest for fame and respect and admiration. Even if you have to labor in obscurity, say what you believe. And so even if you're right, and I think you're wrong that there isn't a big audience for this book, I would say go for it.
It's a good way to live your life. I mean, I'm just a little awed at the magnitude of the task and how you do that. I don't know. I mean, the amount of scholarship behind all this is so immense. The subject's so huge that you have to find a way to do something discreet and simple in it. So anyway,
You'll figure it out. I'm available for consultation.
Thank you.
And we'll talk. So thanks a million, Andrew.
You bet. Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care.